Hello, everyone. It's Woodblock Wednesday, where every Wednesday we get together and discuss Japanese prints, paintings, history, and culture. Today's Woodblock Wednesday features one of my favorite artists of all time. His name is Onchi Koshiro, and I've done quite a few videos on him. I've done some seminar-length videos as well as some other Woodblock Wednesdays. So I encourage all of you to have a look at those. But today's Woodblock Wednesday features a very important and rare painting that hasn't been seen all that often. It was exhibited a couple times in Japan, but then went into sort of the private collection, and it hasn't seen the light of day in decades. So I'm happy to be able to reintroduce it to collectors around the world and maybe make an important first introduction if you're not familiar with the painting. And I should mention, before we get into the Onchi and the painting, that currently on my website, I have an exhibition called From Block to Brush, featuring paintings on oil, on paper, and on silk by a variety of Japanese woodblock print artists. So it's a wonderful exhibition of originals by these artists that are known more as woodblock printmakers. So it's one of those fascinating exhibitions that show very rare work, and I think I put together a group of artists from all genres. So there's something for everyone. So I encourage you to have a look. Okay, having said that, let's get into Onchi. Onchi is arguably Japan's most important 20th century print artist. And I would argue that he's one of Japan's most important 20th century artists, period. He's up there. And he's credited with producing the first work of abstraction in 1915. He was very interested in obviously in abstraction, but also painting. And early on in his education at art school, produced some oil paintings on board, some on canvas, highlighting his artistic gifts. And he was highly influenced by Western artists. And in today's painting that we'll discuss, we will see that influence, the Western influence. But in this particular case, the influence of Cezanne is really strong. And I think it's a really cool opportunity to see this communication between West meets East. So without further ado, let's go have a look at the painting. Okay, here we are in front of the painting. This work is known by the title, Portrait of Onchi Nobuo in a Blue Kimono. The work was done in 1917. It measures 24 by 19 inches. And as I mentioned, it's oil on canvas. This work features Onchi's newly minted wife. They got married about a year ago before this painting was produced. And there's a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of psychological sort of aspects to this painting that I want to kind of focus on. But first, I just want to zoom in so you could take a look at it. You could look at the active brush strokes of the painting. Onchi's early paintings from this period tend to be a bit on the darker side. And I don't mean by subject, I just mean by his choice of colors. The palette on this one is a little brighter than what we normally encounter. And then we see these pinks coming through the blue and the white that reflects it's like light coming in. It's really well done. And as a work of art, Elizabeth Swinton, in her 1980 dissertation on Onchi, indicated that she thought this was Onchi's finest oil painting. I certainly agree that it's one of his best, and we could see why. We'll just dive in closer to the work. So I should point out that the painting is of Onchi's wife. They were married, I think, a year or two before the painting was executed. So you could still say that Onchi and Nobuo and Onchi were still in their honeymoon. And so in this painting, it's kind of surprising because you don't encounter a subject that is light, happy, or I don't know. I mean, you don't see. I would not have thought if I was just looking at this for the first time, not knowing who it was, um, that it was his wife, and even so early on in their relationship. Onchi chooses to portray her in a more psychological way, where you could almost see thoughts crossing her mind by her, by the way that he treated her face. She's sort of deep in contemplation and a bit pensive. Her look is past the viewer out into the distance. But the way that he renders the entire painting, including her face, is soft, it's careful. We see pinks and light browns and some olives put together that create a sense of depth and softness. And then as I move back, you could see that same technique is used throughout her kimono in the background. And for those of you who are familiar with Cezanne, this work certainly has a connection to that great Western painter. Onchi was a huge admirer of Cezanne, and he consumed a lot of the publications that were being imported into Japan. And most of those publications were reproductions of Cezanne's work, but in black and white. So it's interesting to consider this painting with that in mind, because Onchi's palette is darker. And so when we think of Cezanne's work, we think of a touch of brighter colors. I mean, not that bright. I mean, Cezanne did have a palette that resembled this, but that was more on the darker side for him. But for Onchi, this is on the lighter side. And so Onchi sort of interpreted and processed Cezanne's paintings through black and white photography being reproduced in lithography and in publications, maybe newspapers, books, and magazines. And so having said that, if we keep that in mind, we could look at this painting and we could see an artist working through all of that, but at the same time, I could still see Cezanne's work and Onchi's sort of understanding of Cezanne's work. And so I think it's a very successful painting if we look at it in that way. I'm going to zoom in. But I also think the painting's successful because it's just so compelling. The sitter, Onchi's wife, is deep in contemplation, and we could just wonder what she might be thinking. She might be thinking of, well, I think they were. I have to think of that timeline correctly, but I think Onchi's first born daughter, was born not soon after this painting, maybe a year or two. So you could just imagine a newly minted wife thinking about her life in Tokyo with this young artist who's very enthusiastic about painting. She might not have been all that enthusiastic to sit with him for this painting. She might have been shy. I mean, I could certainly see any Japanese woman of this period being shy about being portrayed in painting. And yet, Onchi addresses those concerns. She does look a bit pensive, but at the same time, there's this softness. And the way that he uses color and light are really effective to soften this portrait. I would love to hear what everyone has to say about this painting and what you think, particularly if you are familiar with Cezanne's work. I invite you to all share a comment or two down below. So I'm going to zoom in closer so you could see the detail. I've now started doing these videos in landscape formats instead of portrait, but I'm still sort of staying on that, though probably it would have been maybe a little bit easier to have done it in a portrait format. So I just want to point out that Onchi's artistic ability is just astonishing. I mean, he was a young artist when he produced the first work of abstraction in Japan in printed form in 1915, and was producing some very highly emotional and provocative woodblock prints, both in black and white and in color. And yet, while he was doing those type of things, he was also producing very well. I think these are just excellent paintings of the period. I happen to own a self-portrait for my own personal collection that is really thought-provoking and emotional, and I mean highly expressive and very competent in the medium of oil. So, you know, Onchi's artistry really spanned all areas: oil painting, drawing, and of course woodblock prints. And in woodblock prints, he did both representational subjects as well as abstract works. And so throughout his career, I mean, early on, he showed an interest in abstraction, but abstraction was not understood in Japan so early on. And so he had to put that on the back burner and produce some wonderful portraits. You know, you could think of the portrait of Hagiwara, for instance. That is a fantastic, probably the most important portrait produced in woodblock print form. When we compare it to this painting, we see this. We can anticipate those important portraits because of the sort of the emotional as well as expressive quality in Onchi's work. Here, of course, is done in oil, but you could see his soft, loose printing that will come later. You could, particularly in the background there, you could see these brush strokes that echo or they anticipate Onchi's sort of spontaneous wet printing technique that he would become so well known to do. No, it happens to be framed. It was actually framed by the family in this darker frame, which I don't mind. There's like a gold border around the image, which really does bring out the work. And this painting was exhibited in a couple exhibitions in Japan on Onchi's work, as well as just 20th century painting of this period. But that was in the 80s. And then this painting just sort of fell off and was in a private collection, and it was sold by the family in the 80s. And after that, it was in a private collection for 30, 40 years. And I was lucky enough to be able to acquire it in Japan. So it is now freshly out, and I'm hoping that all Onchi fans are able to see this video and know that it is out and it exists, and the condition is fantastic. Because most of the images of this painting and references were in black and white. There's some irony there, since Onchi was influenced by black and white photography of Cézanne's paintings. But in this case, this is the first time it's been publicized in color. So I'm glad to make the introduction to all of you. So I'm going to zoom in one last time. I often highlight books that are available on the topic that we discussed. And there's two that I want to point out. This is the last book published on Onchi Koshiro. It was done in 1916 to commemorate the exhibition, the retrospective of his work held in Tokyo, and then it traveled to Kyoto. This is considered the catalogue raisonné of Onchi's work, but it's not complete. I mean, I guess suppose no raisonné is complete, but there's a lot of pieces that are missing. But nonetheless, this is a very important, the latest, and in my opinion, the best book out there on Onchi. I highly recommend it, and I also have one available for sale in my bookstore. Another book, which is pretty obscure, is Elizabeth Swinton's dissertation on the graphic art of Onchi Koshiro. This was produced in 1980. It was produced in a hardbound edition. You can find it. It's available in some places, but it's very, very expensive. But for those die-hard Onchi fans, I just want to point out that the book does exist. And I want to sort of I had this bookmarked. Here we are, the page this is a little small chapter on this painting that Swinton discusses. And as I mentioned, she thinks that the painting is one of, I think she said it was Onchi's finest oil painting. So anyway, she's clearly a fan of the painting. And I just want to zoom back to show you the painting on my wall. It looks a little odd next to some sort of abstract works from the post-war period, but it gives you a sense of scale. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining me on this installment of Woodblock Wednesday. Typically, I usually have woodblock prints, but today we're fortunate enough to consider a very important painting by Onchi Koshiro. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about Japanese prints or paintings, have a look at my other Woodblock Wednesdays. I have over 100 videos archived here on YouTube, so please have a look. And of course, visit my website, collectingjapaneseprints.com, for an array of wonderful prints and paintings by Japan's greatest artists, from Hiroshige to, let's see, what's one that I have that's not too late? A Hamanishi that was produced a couple years ago. I have a multitude of prints by artists of all genres. So please have a look. And last but not least, I also have a bookstore of rare reference books on Japanese prints and paintings. So please check that out as well. So I want to thank all of you again, and I look forward to seeing you all next week on our next installment of Woodblock Wednesday. Until then, bye-bye.